pressure on the President of the United States has never been so intense. Will his relationship with this woman finally bring Bill Clinton down? Good evening. Washington, D.C. is in uproar tonight as the critics close in on an embattled Bill Clinton. Did the U.S. president lie about an affair with a 21-year-old White House intern and encourage her to lie about it? If either of these claims is true, it could lead to his impeachment and the end of Bill Clinton's time in the White House. We'll be asking the Washington bureau chief of the Boston Globe, who's just come from interviewing Al Gore, how big a mess he thinks Clinton's in. Despite the fact the RUC chief said today the loyalist paramilitaries, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, who are supposed to be on ceasefire, carried out 3 of the latest sectarian murders, their political representatives are still at the talks table. We asked one of them, what right have they to stay? This family paid £2,800 to a so-called immigration consultant, but feel they got nothing for their money.
All what I got was I was arrested and detained at Croydon police station, that's all. Handcuffed in the presence of my wife and my children. I mean, it was terrible. It was terrible.
Will new government measures bring the cowboy advisors to heel? And as James Cameron's movie extravaganza Titanic sails into view, has he played fast and loose with the facts? And does it matter? The writer Beryl Bainbridge, whose latest novel was based on the Titanic disaster, and the cultural historian Christopher Frayling disagree over artistic license. First, though, the American public have given President Clinton the benefit of the doubt over sexual matters time and again. This time, their patience may run out. The young woman in question was a 21-year-old intern at the White House, Monica Lewinsky. She's denied an affair with the president, but tomorrow she could change her tune. Things are moving quickly. Everything hinges on the 20 hours of taped telephone conversations recorded between Monica and her friend, so-called Linda Tripp, rather an apt name. Peter Marshall pieces together the story which could sink the president.
Fresh from university, on work experience at the White House, Monica Lewinsky is the woman who allegedly had an affair with the president. It could be his undoing. For the Clinton White House, it's the most worrying of all their myriad scandals. Today, when he was supposed to be discussing Middle East peace with Yasser Arafat, he had to address the claim that he'd not only had the affair, but he'd then encouraged Miss Lewinsky in perjury.
The allegations are false, and I would never ask anybody to do anything other than tell the truth. Let's get to the big issues there about the nature of the relationship and whether I suggested anybody not tell the truth. That is false.
It all stems from Paula Jones' civil suit for sexual harassment. Her lawyers subpoenaed confidential testimony from various women believed to have been sexually involved with the president. Monica Lewinsky, on oath, denied any affair. What she didn't know was that her friend, a disaffected former White House employee, Linda Tripp, had been taping conversations in which Miss Lewinsky had many times talked of an 18-month relationship with the president. A Newsweek journalist has heard 90 minutes of the tapes.
Well, clearly, if you listen to the tape, Monica Lewinsky does seem to be describing a sexual relationship with the president and makes references to a sexual relationship to the president. And her anguish and dilemma over being subpoenaed in the Paula Jones case and having to be required to talk under oath about whether or not she had a sexual relationship. In addition, there's quite a bit of talk about the subpoena from the Paula Jones lawyers that asks for all documents and gifts and accessories that she might have in her possession that might document a relationship between her and the president. And there's fear and discussion about how to answer that subpoena without turning over what appears to be incriminating evidence in her possession.
The tapes were handed over to Mr Clinton's would-be nemesis, the independent counsel Kenneth Starr, a man who spent nearly 4 years failing to bring a case against the president over Whitewater and related scandals. Mr Starr got the FBI to record one final conversation between Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky. It happened last week in a Washington hotel, where Miss Lewinsky again allegedly said the president told her to lie. Today, Mr Starr, besieged, was saying little. He was asked about the legitimacy of bugging conversations.
We use appropriate investigative techniques that are traditional law enforcement techniques. We conduct this investigation the way any other investigation would be conducted.
The other central figure is the president's golfing partner and trusted friend, the Washington lawyer Vernon Jordan. He's a Mr Fix-It, fixing a job for Monica Lewinsky in New York, allegedly to buy her silence. He's not commenting on that, but the job offer has been withdrawn. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton denies asking Jordan to persuade her to lie.
I absolutely did not do that. I can tell you, I did not do that. I did not do that. He is in no way involved in trying to get anybody to say anything that's not true at my request.
Past and present staff at the White House are said to be bewildered and demoralised. Tales of gifts from the president to his alleged young mistress, another twist today.
These are the kind of details as they come out, if they're true. Sending a dress to an intern, having the sort of details of the tapes come out that are politically damaging no matter what the president's legal exposure is. He does give out a lot of gifts, but I think it's hard to explain why you're sending a dress to an intern.
This matter isn't going away. Last night, the president was accused of weasel words, initially saying he isn't having an affair with Monica Lewinsky rather than hasn't had one. Grammar apart, White House security logs record her making numerous late-night visits after she stopped working there. Worst of all, tomorrow, in another sworn deposition, I understand she won't repeat her earlier denials of an affair. She'll simply refuse to comment. As the Americans say, she'll take the fifth.
In the court of public opinion, it isn't going to look very good. Now, that still isn't the direct evidence that the prosecutors want to establish that lying and perjury and obstruction of justice took place here, but it is a very bad signal.
Ominously, Monica Lewinsky's lawyer has already addressed on television the possibility of legal immunity for his client if she changes her story.
Hypothetically, as a civil lawyer, I can tell you that, yes, it is possible.
And who would best be positioned to give her that kind of protection?
Well, I think that the investigatory body, which I understand to be the Office of Independent Counsel, is in the position to make any offer like that if they had a mind to.
36 hours ago, Monica Lewinsky was unknown. Now, it's no exaggeration to say this former junior intern may control the future of President Clinton.
That report from Peter Marshall. I'm joined now from Washington by David Shribman, who is from the Boston Globe. David Shribman, what's the latest tonight?
Well, I've just come from the White House, where there's a siege mentality and a siege atmosphere everywhere you look. The people in the White House and Vice President Gore himself, whom I spoke with, are all talking bravely about carrying on with the president's program, about the State of the Union address, which is expected to be delivered next Tuesday. But serious questions remain about how the president can appear before a joint session of Congress, the House and the Senate, without having addressed these questions more directly and more specifically than he has thus far.
Well, we've heard that things are moving very quickly, and Monica Lewinsky may take the fifth tomorrow. She may actually ask for immunity. Mr. Ginsburg there was certainly not ruling that out. If that happens, if she pleads Fifth Amendment, how damaging will that be to the president?
That will be damaging to the president, but it won't substantially change what the situation is here. The situation is here that it's one person's word against another versus what a whole bunch of other people feel are other people's words. Now, it's hard really to sort all this out because none of this really makes a whole lot of sense and none of it is completely consistent. Either there was or there was not, however, a sexual relationship, and either there was or there were not suggestions that Monica Lewinsky taper her testimony or change her story to kind of keep with the program. So those are the core questions, and until we get some answers to those questions, we're going to be in this very awkward, very difficult, and really tragic political purgatory where no one really knows what's up and no one really knows what's down, and the fate of the White House, this presidency, and the stately development of political power and political policy will be totally in upheaval.
Yesterday in the Boston Globe, you said that for many Americans, this is the sum of all their fears. Looking back with the Jennifer Flowers case and so forth, do you think people have been prepared to give Bill Clinton much more leeway than anyone else up until now?
Well, the president has received a lot of leeway, both as a presidential candidate when he was governor of Arkansas and as the president himself. However, the leeway was in the case of mature women or mature woman, and the leeway was not in the case of a 21-year-old person who technically was under the who's under the employment of the President of the United States. Now, the questions kind of multiply. To what extent does the in loco parentis notion apply to the president vis-a-vis an intern? It's a critical question, maybe not legally, but surely politically. To what extent does the president take advantage of or consort with somebody who's less than half of his age and who is technically working for him? That's a major question politically, if not necessarily legally.
But when you look at the cumulative evidence, such as it is at the moment, of White House logs, of apparent gifts, of apparently these taped conversations, ultimately, even if the president is not found guilty of the affair as such, is this going to be damaging continuously?
Yes, it's already been seriously damaging to the president. He was expecting to spend this week kind of to roll out the themes of his budget, which is due the first week of February, and the State of the Union message, which I mentioned is going to happen on Tuesday, is scheduled to happen on Tuesday. Now, all that rollout of all that policy has now been disrupted. All of the questions being directed at the president and at his chief spokesperson don't involve Chairman Arafat and discussions with Israel. They involve this affair. And so really we have a situation where the sordid has completely overshadowed statecraft.
But very briefly, Kenneth Starr appears to be a man with a mission. I mean, how quickly do you think this will move tomorrow? What's your guess on what will happen tomorrow?
Well, I think that by the end of the day tomorrow that we may not have a substantially different situation than we do now. Everybody expects that Monica Lewinsky will plead the Fifth, which is our way of saying she won't say anything to protect herself, and that in the end we're still going to be left with a situation that he said this, she said that, and actually she said more than this and that, she said this and that, and then changed her mind about it. So that's the situation I suspect we'll be in 24 hours from now. But the velocity of this story, the velocity of events, is so fast that anybody who makes a prediction like this is really asking for trouble, because we really can't anticipate what's going to happen. If we had asked you a week ago whether we'd be in this situation today, no sane person would have said so.
Oh, Mr. Shribman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. There was another serious shooting tonight in North Belfast as a Catholic man was ambushed in a hit-and-run attack, ratcheting up the pressure on the peace talks even further. After the confirmation today by the RUC Chief Constable that the Ulster Freedom Fighters, who were supposed to be observing the ceasefire, were responsible for 3 sectarian killings, there was not one direct call for the UFF's political representatives to be expelled from the talks. On the alliance parties, Lord Alderdice called on the government to re-examine the link between paramilitaries and their political representatives. But how did the men at the talks lose control of their terrorists? Here's Martha Carney.
As darkness fell in Belfast this evening, the tension was palpable. Yesterday there'd been 3 shootings, leaving 1 man dead. Tonight came news of another. The relative of a Sinn Féin councillor was ambushed and shot in North Belfast. He's a 30-year-old bakery worker and has been taken to hospital, where his condition is described as serious but stable. Earlier today, the funeral took place of another victim of this week's terrorism. There was very tight security at Jim Guiney's burial. He was a member of the UDA, shot dead by Republicans. The loyalist paramilitary group sent wreaths as a mark of respect, and it's thought that some recent attacks on Catholics may have been in retaliation for his death. Today, the UDA's sister organisation, the UFF, was accused of breaking the ceasefire by the RUC's Chief Constable.
There are undoubtedly a number of loyalist terrorist organisations involved in the recent atrocities, but I have no doubt, for example, that the UFF have been involved in a number of the recent murders.
But what lies behind this descent into sectarian violence? It all began with the death of Billy Wright, the loyalist paramilitary. New murals are being painted on estates in mid-Ulster, where once the UVF held sway, the loyalist volunteer force is now dominant. Paramilitaries led by Billy Wright, who oppose the ceasefire. Security estimates are that the LVF has grown from around 200 last summer to 400 now.
Billy Reid, he's a comic artist with town shows, and like, he was shot there in LA, and it's the least we could do to pay tribute to him. Like, Billy, he stood up for what he believed in, he stood his ground for his people, and like, he wasn't going to let anybody whatsoever, colour or creed, going to deny the people of Ulster their heritage or culture.
A view not shared by the security forces, who hold Wright responsible for a large number of sectarian killings in Mid-Ulster. But there's no doubt he's become a martyr for loyalists. Pastor Kenny McClinton, once a paramilitary himself, presided over Billy Wright's funeral.
What I can see at this point in time is there has been a huge swelling of the ranks. Young people have now flocked to the LVF. It has been the greatest recruitment drive for the LVF that has ever been seen.
But it now seems that recent attacks claimed by the LVF were actually carried out by another paramilitary group, the UFF, also intent on avenging Wright's death. There have been fears about a breach in the Loyalist ceasefire for some time. The political representatives of the UFF were forced to make several visits to the maze and eventually even brought in the Secretary of State to persuade UFF leaders to back the peace process, but to no avail. The first was at a bar in North Belfast on New Year's Eve when one man was killed and 5 injured. The second was the murder of Larry Brennan, whose funeral was held today. It was on Monday night that the Catholic taxi driver was gunned down outside his depot in South Belfast. And last night's murder of Ben Hughes, a Catholic father of 3, has also been linked to the UFF. So why have the UFF's political representatives been unable to control the paramilitaries? The answer lies in the different nature of the paramilitary organisations. In the older and smaller UVF, the paramilitary membership is controlled through a unitary command structure under a single leader who's backing the ceasefire. The UFF and its sister group, the UDA, are much bigger and more loosely controlled. Their paramilitaries are formed into a number of largely autonomous brigades whose leaders sit on an inner council, so individual areas can carry out attacks despite opposition from their politicians in the UDP. So where does that leave the continued presence of the UDP at the talks? Recent terrorism is a clear breach of the Mitchell principles of non-violence, which underpin the peace process. Today there have been calls for the UDP to be ejected.
Can you reach a lasting settlement if people who have openly murdered others are still sitting around the table? The answer is no. I believe the talks will only be able to proceed if we stick to the Mitchell principles. And if the UDP are allowed to stay, I can foresee other political parties to the talks who are associated with paramilitaries committing awful crimes in the future and also not being rejected from the talks.
But so far, none of the parties in the negotiations have mounted a challenge. The talks are finely balanced, so there's a real incentive to keep Gary McMichael's UDP in. If he had to withdraw, it's likely that the other loyalist fringe party, led by David Irvine, the PUP, would leave too. That would leave David Trimble's Ulster Unionists the only unionist party left. He wouldn't have enough strength to represent the unionist vote. Under the consensus rules, no agreement could be reached, and the talks would in all likelihood collapse.
I think the government's position would be that it would be better to have the UDP trying to act as a restraining force on the various rogue elements inside this Protestant paramilitary organisation than to push them outside, particularly at a time when the IRA's made this statement and Sinn Féin would still be inside. I think that would be a recipe for actually perhaps increasing the level of violence rather than actually controlling it.
With further violence continuing on the streets of Belfast tonight, no politician wants to be responsible for creating a vacuum, which could only lead to yet more terrorist attacks.
That report by Martha Carney. Well, I'm now joined by the UDP's David Adams. David Adams, paramilitaries that you represent have carried out sectarian killings, thus breaching the Mitchell Accord. Therefore, you've forfeited your right to be at that table.
No, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, the Alliance Party have indicated that they most likely will lay an indictment against our party. They are quite entitled to do that, and we will defend our position vigorously. The record of our party within this process and within the negotiations will stand examination by anyone. We are totally and absolutely opposed to violence, actively opposed to violence, and we have stated that on many occasions. And more than that, we continue to work and have worked in the past to try and bring violence to an end. Our most immediate priority at this time is trying to bring the present cycle of killings to an end.
You clearly have failed, though. I mean, it's simply the UFF thumbing their finger at you. They actually don't care what you're doing at the peace process because, frankly, they're walking away from it.
Well, your definition of failure, Martha, is totally different to my own. Take, for example, the part that the UDP played in bringing about the loyalist ceasefire over 3 years ago, firstly.
But unfortunately, in terms of the province, that is very, very old history now in terms of the province.
Consider the role played by the UDP over the past 3 years in sustaining that loyalist ceasefire. Now, what has to be remembered in all this is that we are in a very difficult process of conflict resolution. There will be major difficulties within that process. A major difficulty exists at this time. We will not be throwing up our hands and walking away from that problem. We will be doing all we can to try and solve that problem.
So let me just be clear. You represent paramilitaries in the UFF. As far as you're concerned, if the UFF still carry out sectarian killings, it does not make any difference to your position. You still feel that no matter how the level of killings proceed, you've got a right to be at that table.
I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the record of my party will stand up to scrutiny by anyone. And the major priority for us at this time is to try our very best and use our influence to try and bring this cycle of killings to an end. Now, if there are those within the process and outside the process who think that the best road for us is to walk away from the process, to throw our hands up and say to the paramilitaries, listen, we are not going to try and influence you at all, do whatever you want, then I can't see the logic in that at all, when what we're actually all supposed to be trying to achieve is a peaceful and democratic resolution of the conflict within Northern Ireland. We have a role to play in that. We have a vital role to play in it. We have played a very positive role up to now, and we will continue to do that.
But you're clearly not convinced members of the UFF. Now, when the nationalist community are saying that the government's blueprint leans towards the loyalists, what a time now for the UFF to be taking out their weapons again. This is completely skewed, isn't it?
The government's blueprint leans towards democracy, and that is agreed by everyone within the process except for Sinn Féin. And let's remember, the catalyst for this recent cycle of killings was the INLA murder of Billy Wright within the Maze prison. Now, since then, the INLA have deliberately murdered an innocent Protestant in Dunmurry village.
So is that a justification for the UFF action?
I am not justifying in the slightest or trying to justify anything. What I am saying is that this process is continually on a knife edge. If one group decide to go out and start and murder Protestants, then history teaches us that it's going to have a reaction. Now, our job is to try and bring this cycle of killings to an end, and we will be trying our utmost to do that.
David Adams, thank you very much for joining us from Belfast. Unscrupulous immigration advisors and lawyers who fleece would-be immigrants and asylum seekers could face prison under proposals unveiled by the Home Secretary today. Jack Straw said the Home Office was aware of more than 250 companies or individuals whose activities give cause for concern. Now the government proposes compulsory regulation for immigration advisors. But do their plans go far enough, fast enough? Jackie Long investigates the suffering caused by incompetent or exploitative advisors.
About 7:15.
Yeah, my car didn't spark when I was...
Normal family life has been hard won for Francis Reynolds. Originally from Ghana, he now has indefinite leave to remain in Britain. The rather tortuous language of a Home Office judgment, which simply means the whole family can now call this their home. Francis was saved by a good solicitor after a consultant took thousands of pounds and left him wallowing in a detention centre for months.
They came out like, well, we're going to help you. We know people inside there. They know people working for them, the Home Office. We've done it for people, and people have got their British passports, or we've done it for a lot of people. So it makes you believe. And then there was a lady who was well-dressed. She steps in. You can smell the perfume. You can see the good clothes, expensive clothes. And she looks, for a wealthy woman.
You paid one consultant £2,800. What did you get for your money?
Nothing. All what I got was I was arrested and detained at Croydon Police Station. That's all. Handcuffed in the presence of my wife and my children. It was terrible.
For the Reynolds solicitor, this case is depressingly familiar.
I often get cases where people haven't been given good advice, and then they're possibly in more trouble than they would have been in the first place. They're very frightened. They're about possibly to be removed from their family forever or to be removed to a situation of persecution. They're very vulnerable. They can be preyed upon.
180,000 people are currently awaiting a decision from the Home Office over some question of immigration, asylum or citizenship. There's a huge backlog of cases, the system made grindingly slow by claims pursued either pointlessly or illegally.
If they come in, say, from Ghana as a visitor.
Jane Coker from the Immigration Law Practitioners Association has been doing immigration work for nearly 20 years.
Under no circumstances.
She helped us draw up a profile of a no-hope case for us to put to some immigration consultants. Newsnight's immigration candidate is a 21-year-old woman. From Ghana, she's on a 6-month visitor's visa staying with friends, but she wants to get a student permit.
I would expect anybody who knew anything about immigration law to be advising, you don't stand a chance. If I put the application in, it will be refused. You are wasting your money.
The Home Office agree with Jane Coker. No one should have to pay for anything. There's simply no chance of our applicant being successful. Nevertheless, we phoned 10 consultants and put the details of our fictional case to them. 2 said it was indeed a waste of time. 5 didn't rule it out, but said she should come in for a free consultation. 3 were more explicit. She stood a chance, but she would have to pay something. One of the companies who offered a consultation for cash was the Global Legal Immigration Consultancy. We spoke to the owner, Elizabeth Nkube.
Yes, I can get her a student permit if she's got all the necessary requirements for her to apply for a student.
What are those?
Well, I can't tell you now. If she comes along and then we can discuss it.
And how much will it cost?
It will be £70 for the consultation.
And then to make the application?
Making the application is £250. Following it up right through, writing to the Home Office and sending it up and everything.
And you will definitely be able to do this for us?
Yes, I'm definitely able to do this for you.
We went to see exactly what the company could do for us, given that we'd been told by the Home Office and immigration law experts no one should have to pay for an application which was pointless. We asked Miss Nkube what we would get for our £70 consultation.
The first consultation is to give you the choice to educate you on the rules of the Home Office.
But you know that the Home Office will say no.
It's not that they will say no. Here it's written in black and white that they can look at each case in circumstances. In each case on its merits. It will take each case on its merits. So and the Home Office, besides the rules, has a lot of discretion in it. Right.
So it's still worth, you suggest, somebody coming in and paying you £70, even though you know that they will say no?
It's worth the consultation. You give them the choice. You tell them these are the rules.
Miss Nkube said she believes in exceptional circumstances such a permit might be issued. But when we called the Home Office again, they said that simply wasn't correct. Khaled didn't have the rules laid out for him by his consultant. On the contrary, he was advised to break them and lie to the Home Office about his nationality. In return, his advisor disappeared with his benefit book. Khaled was left in court, facing deportation. Now legally allowed to stay in Britain, he's still too frightened to show his face.
He presented himself as my brother, and you know, when he talks, and so you say, yes, he's from the same place. He's one of us, and he's okay. So you begin to believe him. He's very good at that. He can put you at ease and make you believe him.
But in the end, it didn't work.
No, it didn't.
So do you have any idea where this man is now?
I don't know where he went. I think he went to look for other people, you know, and use more people, exploit them.
Today, the Home Office proposed a register of consultants to put an end to this kind of exploitation. Keith Vaz regularly deals with people in his Leicester constituency who've fallen foul of the self-styled immigration experts.
but he has some reservations about how effective a register can be.
There is a potential problem for those who don't wish to register, and also the cost of maintaining the register and monitoring what work is being done. And I therefore think that this is going to be much more complicated than one could imagine.
Is there the will to spend the amount of money on policing this register?
I think there probably isn't the will, because I think that immigration is still seen as something of a Cinderella, a fringe issue. And that's why I think the best course of action in the end will be to leave it to qualified lawyers who can be complained against if they give bad advice.
But qualifications aren't necessarily a guarantee of fair play. Like the bogus consultants, some solicitors have worked out that immigration advice can be easy money. It's one of the fastest growing areas of legal aid work. And today, the Home Secretary said around 40 firms of qualified solicitors were thought to regularly give advice, which at best is incompetent, at worst, positively fraudulent.
It's not just the immigration consultants. We're aware of many instances of firms of solicitors who, whether through incompetence or dishonesty, have irreparably damaged perfectly good cases and perfectly good claims, leaving clients who were initially in a vulnerable position in quite a hopeless one. Immigration law is quite a complex and rapidly changing area of law, where the consequences of a lawyer getting it wrong can be very serious on the individual clients. What I think would make things better would be the compulsory accreditation and regulation of immigration lawyers, so that only those who are professionally competent to provide advice are allowed to do so.
In fact, one of the first people Francis and Hilda Reynolds turned to for help was a qualified solicitor.
I felt bitter. I had to go to them even to get them to start up the case again. They referred me to a new solicitor, but this new solicitor also took some money. He said he'd give to a barrister. He took $1,200 and he also didn't do anything. He just ended up saying, okay, he's been deported, he can go. There's nothing else we can do.
For the Reynolds family, at least, the worst is over. But for others like them, even today's proposals will offer little comfort in the future.
That from Jackie Long. In a moment, Titanic, the most expensive movie ever made, but does it play fast and loose with the facts, and does it matter? But first, some of the rest of the day's news. Brian Clough has been charged with misconduct by the Football Association. The accusations come after a 4-year inquiry into so-called bungs, unauthorised payments made on the transfer of players in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Mr Clough's former assistant, Ronnie Fenton, and the former Arsenal scout, Steve Burtonshaw, were also charged. Hundreds of thousands of people have attended the first ever Mass celebrated by a Pope on the island of Cuba. Now Pope John Paul II, who addressed the vast crowd in Santa Clara, has returned to the capital Havana, where he's soon to have a formal meeting with the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The man charged with the Unabomber killings in America has agreed to plead guilty to murder charges. Lawyers acting for Theodore Kaczynski, whose 18-year letter bomb campaign left 2 people dead and more than 20 injured, agreed to a deal in return for a life sentence rather than execution. A voluntary euthanasia campaigner tonight told the BBC she'd helped to kill 3 of her friends who had incurable illnesses. Novelist Celia Fremlin says she's convinced that doctors concerned knew what happened and were full of sympathy. Titanic finally splashed onto British movie screens tonight. The sinking of the great liner in 1912 is one of the most epic stories of this century. And with the help of $200 million, James Cameron has recreated the ship, populated with a cast of thousands, and despite the critics, filled American cinemas. But has he brought the truth to the screen? History is a rich seam for filmmakers, but when they mine it, do they have a duty to be accurate, or is artistic license justifiable? We'll be debating that in a moment with the author Beryl Bainbridge and cultural historian Christopher Frayling. But first, how inaccuracies in the film Titanic have deeply upset a relative of one of the officers who went down with the ship.
The water is freezing and there aren't enough boats. Half the people on the ship are going to die.
For God's sake, there's women and children down here!
Titanic, the Hollywood version, killed off 1,500 leading lights and bit part actors in just 45 minutes, with absolutely no expense spared. In reality, it took just over 3 hours for the unsinkable to happen. And 86 years after Titanic hit an iceberg and sank a mile below the surface of the Atlantic, it's been left to the families of those who perished to ensure their memories remain intact. William Murdoch was watch commander on the Titanic when it hit the iceberg. According to history, he was washed overboard and died. His family and his village, Dobbity in Scotland, remember Murdoch as a hero. The local school hands out a Murdoch bursary to 14-year-old boys. But that's not the story on the big screen. We're not allowed to show you the scene in question, but late in the film, in the midst of all the mayhem, he's seen shooting a passenger dead and then turning the gun on himself. William Murdoch's nephew Scott treasures his uncle's telescope and his memory. He wrote to James Cameron to protest at Titanic's portrayal of the watch commander, but never received a reply.
I felt that it was a slur on a man's character, which certainly McMaster Murdoch didn't deserve, because he had rescued lots and lots of people, and as far as I knew, he had never committed suicide and was washed away.
Titanic has won 4 Golden Globes, sold £22 million worth of tickets in just 3 days when it was released in the US, and looks likely to achieve similar success here. With such accolades, this version could easily become viewed as the definitive record of the sinking of the Titanic. Artistic license doesn't just happen in Hollywood, and it isn't new. Shakespeare turned Richard III, apparently an upstanding fellow, into a hunchbacked ogre. And Dickens rewrote the French Revolution in A Tale of Two Cities. More recently, Michael Collins came in for criticism over its portrayal of the Irish struggle.
It's very, very difficult when you're making a historical film, because you've also got to think about the drama and the tragedy and the comedy for the audience. And films are very expensive to make. So you've got to think about the audience first. And sometimes if you did total accuracy, it would be total boredom.
I think when they start looking back, they start rewriting history. A lot of people were being conned.
James Cameron has been praised for his eye for detail in Titanic. Some historical errors may be acceptable in a 3-hour film, but if a few small voices are unable to protect the memory of those no longer able to defend themselves, should the onus for accurate historical representation be shouldered by the artists?
God almighty.
Titanic previewing tonight and opening everywhere tomorrow. Christopher Frayling, can you understand the Murdoch's family's deep hurt about this?
I can. I think film in particular sort of colonises people's unconscious and puts ideas in their heads about what history was really like. It's something to do with, you've got to have a kind of realism in film. It's got to be photographic, and it looks as though it's photographing the real thing. I mean, remember Butch Cassidy, where they go to Bolivia, and you know you're in Bolivia because there's 2 llamas standing by the railway station. There aren't any llamas in Bolivia, but everyone now thinks there are llamas in Bolivia because of Butch Cassidy. And in a way, there are now, if you see what I mean, because film has made it so. So I think, yes, filmmakers have a certain obligation, without being too pedantic about it, to get things right.
Well, Bear Brainbridge, a few days ago you saw another preview of Titanic in London. Do you think the Murdoch family have a case?
No, there's no actual factual evidence whatsoever in the inquiry to say that that happened. And in a sense, you see, there was a sort of report, but I don't know that one believes them, because immediately after the accident, most reports were very inaccurate because of the panic and everything else. But shots were fired over the crowd.
And you put the shots in your book?
Yes, but there was no actual proof that anybody was killed. And some people did say that Murdoch shot himself, but that wasn't proved either. There's no thing about it. And in the film, you see, when he shoots himself, it's not that he's committing suicide. Maybe he does it because he's sorry that he shot this man.
But if that in itself is inaccurate, the point surely is that a lot more people will see this film than will ever read the reports that were into the inquiry. So does someone like James Cameron have some sort of responsibility towards history?
I think history that far back, no.
Really?
And I don't think you'd remember Murdoch's name. I agree.
Was that not a key incident in the film, though? Because his family are still alive.
Yes, well, I'm not so sure that I call family, you know, I think I don't think one's great-grandfather or great-uncle is family anymore. I think it's too far in the past. And anyway, history is always inaccurate.
Is history always inaccurate, Christopher?
Well, I think where things get a bit dicey, and I gather this happens in the Titanic film, is where they use real-life footage of, in this case, the wreck. And in the case of Schindler's List, in the last reel, you have the real people who were featured in the fictional story. And a line is being crossed about what you can believe and what you can't believe. You've watched a 3-hour melodrama which happens to be set in a historical setting, which one hopes they get as right as possible. And then there's a wreck with real dead bodies in it. Now, there's something going on there that makes me very uneasy. There's a shift of register from one kind of evidence, as it were, to another. And that worries me.
You heard Derek Malcolm saying in the film that the problem sometimes is the storyline as given in history would just be too boring.
And there are films like that. I mean, there's a film called Heaven's Gate about the Johnson County War in the Wild West, where you virtually found out, you know, each cow's blood group in the stampede. There was so much detail, and it was virtually unwatchable. That's true.
But take something like Bridge Over the River Kwai. I mean, the fact that it might be deeply boring that the leading British officer was actually a really good guy, sure, that's not enough to turn him into a bad guy.
Well, I think with film, you get this strange thing of the background. A lot of research goes into the background, a lot of special effects, a lot of looking at archive photographs, trying to colour it in, rather like a Victorian historical painting, and superimposed on that a very melodramatic story, which has its own conventions. And these two things sort of collide sometimes.
Well, what do you think is the raison d'etre of the filmmaker? Is it first and foremost entertainment?
Well, I think Cameron is absolutely obsessed, one with water and two with the Titanic. Yeah, and the technical effects are magnificent. The storyline, almost forget it, it doesn't really matter. I think his reasons for doing it is that he just wanted to portray as accurately as possible, sort of so that you shoot back in your seat, a huge, beautiful, glorious ship breaking up and sinking. I mean, the sinking is the last half hour. And that is incredible.
But you see, why use the real names? I mean, Hollywood in the 20s and 30s, when it did things like this, would change the names slightly or fictionalise the character. You kind of knew it was Franklin D. Roosevelt or whatever, but it wasn't him. If you're going to use the real names and actually dress people up with great care as the real people, why do it? I mean, why not change Captain Smith's name to Captain Jones and make him into a psychopath? Do you know what I mean? I mean, why bother? This funny thing of wanting to make it seem realistic, but at the same time not.
Well, again, you see, it's awfully sad if people think Murdoch is now a murderer and that he was a coward because he shot himself. But in actual fact, you see, Captain Smith is always portrayed as this marvellous man, this great man who sailed this ship. But the facts of that case is that he'd also banged into something in the sister ship in the Olympic. The reason the Titanic went off is because he'd smashed into the Seahawk, or a ship called the Hawk.
Very much. Thank you very much, Christopher. Will you be going to see it?
I will. I think the special effects sound great.
Thank you both very much indeed. And it opens all over the country from tomorrow. And before we go just to tomorrow's front pages, and as if you wouldn't believe it, they're completely dominated by the Clinton story. The Guardian, I haven't asked anyone to lie. The Independent, you'd think the boy would learn. A conquest too far for Clinton? Question mark, of course. Financial Times, Clinton told to hand over White House documents. Allegations amid talk of impeachment. The Times, Clinton fights to save his presidency. The Telegraph, Clinton on rack over sex lies and audio tape. White House woman may implicate President. We understand she is going to take the Fifth Amendment tomorrow. Moving on now to the Mirror. Martin Bell and the secret £9,400 appears to be election cash that the allegation is that he did not talk about properly and declare. And finally in the Daily Mail, Clinton stares into the abyss. That's all from Newsnight tonight. I'll be back with more tomorrow night. Until then, from all of us here, a very good night.